Today is one of the many days where the church and the world play in harmony rather than unison. Today is Easter. You know this. I know this. The children who hunted for eggs and found bunnies made of chocolate when they woke this morning, they know it. The church, of course, knows it too, but thinks we're wrong. The church says, yes, of course it's Easter, but we're not going to call it that. And you shouldn't either, not if you want to be a really good Christian. I hate it when the church says these words to us. It's famous for doing so. The Reformed Church does this sort of renaming exercise at several points in the year, but perhaps most notably at Easter, which the church insists on calling the Resurrection of the Lord Sunday. Just rolls right off the tongue. And at funerals or memorials, which the church insists on being called services in witness to the resurrection. Again, the kind of thing easy to put into your calendar. If you've ever been to a cocktail party where some sort of know-it-all spoil sport, you know the type, or seen what seems to be a perennial meme on social media about the etymology of the word Easter, perhaps you may know why. Our English word for Easter comes from an early Middle Ages name for the Anglo-Saxon goddess Uester. She was the goddess of spring and fertility, symbolized often with images of bunny rabbits and small chicks. And this, so say the spoil sports and the I just reposted without actually fact-checking anything or absorbing any new information, this isn't really about my learning, it's about yours, is proof that all religion is a lie, because it's all just stealing from some religion that came before. Perhaps it's understandable that the church's comms team over the years has dispensed with the common name and rebranded the whole thing the Resurrection of the Lord. And perhaps for the church, it is more important to get resurrection into the title than it is to conjure images of bunnies or eggs. Truthfully, as a person concerned about who's going to come to church in future generations, I'm not so sure. And so I woke this morning, as I do on many mornings, ready to play one of my chief jobs, translator between church and world, to make the necessary apologies to whichever side is claiming to be the most hurt by the people, those people, and what they did. It's a bit like parenting, I imagine, and on services of Christmas and Easter, I'm often reminded of this when I get to meet new friends or visitors to our church, and I can spot immediately what church they grew up in. It's the days of the year when I get called father by people I've never met. It's a real thing, and it makes me smile. And so while we're sorting out, for all of you new, while we're sorting out bunnies and Easter eggs, which, to my knowledge, the church has kept silent on any attempt at rebranding Resurrection of the Lord eggs, the church, me, here at West End, I'll share with all of you right now that my preferred pronoun is simply will. Today is the church's day. It's the high point of all liturgy. It is the day to which all days in the year lead. From Christmas to Easter, all days goeth. And it is the day from which all days begin. Every Sunday of the year, liturgically speaking, is a sort of mini Easter. A funeral service is a sort of mini Easter. For those who were baptized with Christ will rise with Christ. But today, this is no mini sort of Easter. This is Easter Maximus. Today is the day when, heeding the women's leadership, we find an empty tomb and an eternal promise. Today is the day we attempt to remember what we have known, to relive the history of the greatest story ever told, and to do so with brass in a sanctuary full of people and musicians and lilies and the communal bottle of Allegra that my staff has been passing around this morning. Today we pull out all the stops, and Henry indeed will, and we'll remember and we'll remember loudly. And also, preacher, while we're remembering, remember that today is really about the music, so maybe keep your own remarks short so we can all get on with Resurrection of the Lord brunch, reservations for which don't exist on Open Table, and recommendations for which are not covered by Time Out. Today is a day when the church and the world have different language, and it may seem to be at cross purposes. I ask you to sink more deeply in, wise people that you are, and see that today is a day when more of the world files into church sanctuaries to hear what the church has to say. This is all part of resurrection, which is to say, it's all part of mystery. None of us will ever understand, because life and death belong solely to God, and God alone gets the last word. In the book known as the Acts of the Apostles, or more commonly just Acts, that Winnie just read for us, Peter gives a sermon. Now, in the Gospels, when Jesus is around, only Jesus gives sermons. Peter doesn't preach during Jesus' earthly life, nor do any of the others. The only sermons recorded during the life of Jesus by the Gospel writers are Jesus's. And we find this early sermon of Peter recorded in the book of Acts. And it's fun to read. And I kind of understand why it is that we don't have Peter or John preaching during the time of Jesus. I think of it as when I first started preaching, and a sermon was a sermon, but gosh, it was something else if one of my preaching or theology or theatrical mentors was in the house. Peter, of course, learned from the greatest preacher of all time, which is no discredit to the great preachers that I have learned from. But here, Peter is preaching, and it is always a good idea for a preacher, young or old, to stay pretty close to the text. Peter's sermon that Winnie read follows a pattern of what we might call a teaching sermon. It's a history sermon. It's a rehashing of things you're supposed to already know. In it, Peter tells the faithful and the doubting alike that we are witnesses to all that Jesus did during his earthly life. Peter preaches, we are witnesses to how the state gave into a hateful mob and sanctioned an execution. We are witnesses, Peter writes, to how God raised him on the third day. We are witnesses to how Jesus ate and drank with those closest to him after he rose from the dead. We are witnesses to how all who believe in him receive forgiveness of sins through him. That's a pretty good sermon, Peter. That's the memory. It's the story. From life to death to life eternal, Peter tells us we are witnesses. This is what Peter's people needed to remember, and what he hoped they would still be able to say was the topic of the sermon on Sunday at a dinner on Thursday. Now, Peter is a fabulous preacher. He's also a wonderful and loving and truth-speaking and sinning and being redeemed and getting it wrong and trying again human, upon whom Christ set the foundations of the church. And we still witness to the foundations laid by Peter and those early Christ followers. If you've ever been to Rome, you walk those steps. You stand on top of his grave. You see the foundation of the church. But we, 21st century people that we are, people of faith that we are, have witnessed a great deal more too than Peter got to see all those centuries ago. And so the sermon goes on. If, that is, we see witnessing that attends to both the living and the dead, to both things seen and things unseen, to what God continues to create and which God is not yet finished. We are witnesses to the miracles that are you, of who you are that is still being honed and polished to shine with the one true light that God placed in each of us. Peter was remembering the works of his best friend, who was also his boss and his companion and his savior, and the one that he denied. Peter, no doubt, remembers a lot more at those 2 a.m. moments that I'm sure he had than this nice, tight sermon he gives us in the book of Acts. But that's one of the things I love most about preaching. Every sermon, for 2,000 years since the death of Jesus, has been a work in process. If you miss something this week, there's always next Sunday. Some things need to be mentioned immediately. Some things can wait. The gospel is eternal. The news is ephemeral. The best preaching is too. Now, many preachers and many churches think the best preaching on resurrection needs to occur on Easter Sunday. Actually, the best preaching is done by the daffodils and the lilies that are outside. And we humans are still trying to learn their language. Easter Sunday, the Resurrection Sunday, is a Sunday of unexpected exits from life and entrances into a tomb on Friday, and as the gold leaf says, into hell on Saturday, and to life eternal comes Sunday morn. What is last is not so. What is a going out turns out to be a coming in, and what is lost may always be gained. Exits and entrances, forwards and backwards, Alpha and Omega. You don't know anything, my beloved children, says God. I get the final word, even over death. For what the women first learned, a series of Marys, other ones too, who, like women in all generations, get up far before the men folk do, and make the breakfast and head out to the grocery store, and in this case, head to the cemetery to make sure there are flowers and anointments before anyone else has to get there. And when they got there, they were surprised. The exit was supposed to be final. He wasn't supposed to leave the tomb. They had no idea. As one of my colleagues shared with us on Friday in our Good Friday services on the last words from the cross, can you imagine a Good Friday without Easter? Matt told us. And then he said, Mary did, and Peter did, and all those people who were witnesses to the first things only knew it was Friday. We have the good fortune of knowing that Easter Sunday comes 3 days after Good Friday. Those women didn't. Jesus had left. Jesus had died. That was supposed to be the end of the story. It's how it had always been. And they went to assure themselves and each other that the world was still the world. How often do we do these things? How often do we make the old ways the ways that we continue to expect and do and honor without the faintest idea that there might be a miracle just 3 days hence? Easter comes after death. And we know it very well now. At least in church we do. You who have tended the bedside of a sick one, of a loved one who is dying. You who have held the hand of someone who didn't know which way it would go. Were you always so sure? Do what you know now supersede what you knew then? And is there not more life always? This is the promise of Jesus in his sermon in the Gospel of John. I have come to give you life, and life abundant. We could also say, to paraphrase Jesus, I have gone to give you life and life abundant. And every Easter Sunday, churches all around this world, all built on the foundations that Peter built, all proclaim this simple truth that no one can possibly explain other than God. In life and in death, you belong to God. God who creates us, God who speaks words of existence into the cosmos, God who wakes up every single day and says, let there be light. And indeed there is. And indeed there is more light. And indeed there is resurrection. It happens every day. You'll go out from here, you'll talk about the brass and the orchestra and the choir. They sounded fabulous, you'll say. The kids had a blast. I hope you'll remember your resurrection is assured. I hope you will go from this place to the next, knowing that your life and death are held by Almighty God. And I will tell you that there are no better arms in which to be held. Happy Easter. Let's call it that.